So welcome everybody. I'm Nadia Kingsley, and I run Fairacre Press, and I'm just so delighted to see so many of you. I'm not surprised because we've got such a lovely event ahead of us. So I think you're all very discerning to be coming along, but it's just wonderful to see you all. Thank you all so much for coming. So we have, you'll see in one of the little boxes, Carl Tomlinson, whose new Fairacre Press poetry pamphlet, Changing Places, is why we are all here. But we also have three other extraordinary writers with us. And I would love to have the chance to publish them at some point, hint, hint. But we have Alan Buckley, Helen Mort, and Charles Foster here as well. Sorry, I'll just admit a few other. No, that's cool. Everyone's in so far. So with no further ado, or whatever the expression is, I will introduce Carl Tomlinson. This will be his first part. He'll come back at the end as well and do some more poems at the end. But welcome to Carl Tomlinson. Hey.
Thank you. The lie of the land. The lie of the land says she is ours to command. We yield to the strongest hand, that we may mark it as home, fence it off as our own, keep out the unwelcome unknown. The slugs and the rats and the weeds know nothing of title deeds, don't care about heritage seeds. The pigeons, the pheasants and rooks haven't read the doomsday book. They just shit on my dirty looks. The lie of the land says man is an island, that we are where we stand, that it's ours and not yours, and the world isn't there anymore when we slide the bolt on the door. That we're safer alone, that we need clearer zones, and that we can tame it with drones. This is the lie of the land, that wall and fence and gate make an independent state. When I was bringing the poems that are in the pamphlet together, when I was writing them, when I was thinking about them, when I was deciding what to write about, the title I had in mind for the pamphlet was The Lies of the Land. And over the past year, when I've been working with Helen Mort, who's been a wonderful editor and mentor over that time, that was still very much the idea for a title. But towards the end of that process, the title Changing Places emerged. And one of the places which changed, one of the places which is central to this pamphlet, was my grandfather's farm. A place where, as a child, I was able to milk and make hay, spend many happy hours, and one or two sad ones as well. Coming to grief. We were most of the way to Middleton when I discovered that grief doesn't always dress in death. One of my parents said that Three Gates Farm, where 6 generations had tilled the last of Lancashire's silty soil, was being sold that week. In the winter of '63, my granddad made the front page, phoning for a snowplow, because the lane was 6 foot deep. Now we were in the Observer again, in the back of the classifieds, along with all the other lots due under the Marshall hammer. Reading the paper emptied my eyes. I realised whatever childish plans I'd made for those 50 acres of gentle land, nudged between mill towns and millstone grit, were to be knocked down for 26 grand in the end, in the old boar's head, by an auctioneer I never met. And by my father's teenage need to leave that land and make his life his own, and by my uncles trying to stay where I was sure we all belonged, and by Grandad's explaining that even the hencoats would go. So the scheme to keep one to use as a den, that went south as well. The parlour's long since seen a cow. There's nothing like a farm there now, but the breath of beasts on a winter day, and the sweetness of cow shit and hay, surprise that grief back into me. Some very kind people have written some very kind things on the back of this pamphlet about the poems that are in there. And it would be invidious to say which of them I like most. However, one particular line did hit me straight between the eyes when I read them, when I read the endorsements that Nadia had managed to gather together. She worked so hard to bring together. And this is from Di Slaney. Di Slaney doesn't know me from a hole in the ground, so she could not possibly have known when she wrote this. Murmured conversations, the poems sound like murmured conversations perched on a bar stool in a country pub. She could not possibly have known, unless she's psychic, that this poem came from a conversation with a mate over a pint in our local. And my friends from a town in West Yorkshire where they used to make carpets, and in the days before environmental protection, they got rid of their waste dye by chucking it in the river. Sly for BS. He's back, 40 years after his arse scraped that mark in the side of the bank. He's brought her to where the bedrock still shines, where he and his mates tore down the slope on cardboard boxes they pinched from Fairbrace's mill. We were motorbikes, tanks, racing cars, planes. Bit by bit, they ripped out the grass. Then Lancashire's leftover rain swept the soil into the cold as carpet dye water. Oak trees have rooted around his line in the land. He turns, she smiles. They swing out of town on a ring road, scarred on the face of the place where he grew. As I said, being a kid and having a grandfather with a farm was a kind of bliss, really. I got to do all sorts of lovely things. And one of the things that it's never really left me as a pleasure was dealing with the eggs that I'd collect and sort. We still keep hens today, and there's something lovely about picking up an egg. This poem's called Toy. Beasts and fields and milk meant muck and sweat and aches before baths, then tea and bed. Grading eggs was child's play. The chance to operate that bathroom blue, part bagatelle, part bowling alley, where work was done by gravity, in a mood you might call levity. Warm in the palm, the morning's eggs were fed along a gentle slope to roll down shoots which matched their size. Outgrades and breakages didn't go to waste. They were fried for breakfast, baked in cakes. It turns out that my toy was worth more than most men made in a week. It must have saved a lot of work. It's now my huge pleasure to introduce Alan Buckley. Alan's first collection, Touched, was published about a year ago by Happenstance Press, and that was preceded by two pamphlets, The Long Call and Shiver. We first met 30 plus years ago and reconnected more recently through the world of poetry. And over the past few years, Alan's become a great supporter of my writing, a stimulating walking companion, and a very good friend. Please give your ears and your hearts to Alan Buckley.
Thank you for that lovely introduction, Carl. It's such a pleasure to be reading at the launch of your first pamphlet, so thank you. The 4 poems I've picked to read, I picked poems that I hope would in some way respond to some of the themes and concerns in Carl's pamphlet. Badger. Glimpsed for no more than a second or two, I was pushing 85 near Stokenchurch Gap, but enough for a thought to surface. The possibility that the heft of snout and fur by the central barrier belonged to a creature that was deaf and asleep, having nodded off in the morning sun as it looked for a chance to cross. And this was why it lay there, oblivious to the cars and lorries bouldering past. Deaf and asleep, its belly filled with a slither of worms as it dreamed its brockish dreams, in which it was busy reliving the night just gone, when it scuttled through fields of silvery grass beneath an avuncular moon. And beyond the black, hard river that carves its way down Aston Hill, a hole in the earth was waiting, a small darkness, ready to fall back behind this animal's tail, like the heavy curtain at the entrance to a private room, shielding from view a silent, untouchable space. This second poem is called Dinosaurs, and it's set in Devon, and it stars my eldest godson, who's called Osric, although he's sometimes for some reason called Ozzy B. And him and his twin brother Kai were originally, they were due to be born at the beginning of March 2017, but they actually arrived in December 2016. So they had quite a perilous journey into life. This poem was written 2 years after their birth. And it has an epigraph from Robert Frost's poem, Birches, Earth's the right place for love. I don't know where it's likely to go better. Dinosaurs. With great intent, you test your toddler's legs against this cattle-carved ground, the weather remarkably mild for New Year's Day. Across the valley, Easton Tor seems an eternal sentinel. There's no low hum of traffic, no vapor trails stretching out above us, and we might imagine our print on the land is slight. The moss-greened walls tumbling down the slopes, the narrow lanes, white cottages, a slow accretion over hundreds of years. Your legs decide they've had enough for now. You stop and wobble, raise your arms. Your dad responds by lifting you onto his back. You're clutching a plastic dinosaur whose name, Tyrannosaurus Rex, you announce with pride. You've not yet learned what extinction means. Everything you see is new and bright, unshadowed by what we know. It's topsy-turvy, Ozzy B. It should be you who makes a mess, and us who clean it up. We reach the gateway at the common's edge. You've come a long way, scarcely bigger when you were born than the toy that's in your hands. And though what helped you stay was frenzied skill and that great anchor, love, I need to believe there's some exceptional longing for life in you, a superhuman push of blood that finally planted you here. Godson, we need you to be godlike. Forgive us this day the weight we place on your shoulders. I'm going to go back to this lovely pamphlet here, which came out also with happenstance back in 2016. I was brought up on the Wirral Peninsula in the northwest of England, which is where this poem's set, and it's set specifically by a huge sandstone outcrop called Thor's Stone, which is in the middle of Thurston Common. Red Rock. Oh, actually, one thing I should say, because I think this is important. I think what this poem is about, as much as any poem is about anything, is that there are some things that are more important than knowing where you stand. Red Rock. My mind's unsure, but my legs carry their own memory. I stride through birch, rowan, oak, step out into the clearing, its banks purple with heatherbell, ling. I climb the rock and it's easier and harder than before, my adult shoes too big for the grooves and gullies. The top's a memorial, names and hearts roughly carved. At one end, a scorched hollow, frilled with ash. In it, a winded tinny, a gasless lighter, the roach of a joint, sucked brown. Some claim Norsemen made sacrifices here, though the rock dwarfs all stories, it is its own myth. I've come back to this jut of land that rises between Dee and Mersey, and I know it's not where I was born, and it's not where I've lived for 30 years, but knowing is half a lie. Here, a knuckle of this peninsula's spine, there's red in my veins, red beneath my feet, and today, at least, I feel where I stand. And I think I will end with this poem, which references in part the work I do in my other life, working with refugees for a charity in Oxford. And it's a poem that references a very old piece of writing by the Venerable Bede, writing in the 7th century. And in his ecclesiastical history of the English people, he wrote the following famous passage. It seems to me that the life of man on earth is like the swift flight of a single sparrow through the banqueting hall, where you are sitting at dinner on a winter's day with your captains and counsellors. While he is inside, the bird is safe from the winter storms, but after a few moments of comfort, he vanishes from sight into the wintry world from which he came. So man appears on earth for a little while, but of what went before this life or what follows, we know nothing. And this poem is called Spirits of the Dead. Having been taken to Christchurch Meadow to get to know more of the city, he spotted a horde of them, cawing and strutting their sheened blackness. In his country, people believe they're the spirits of the dead, come back to watch over the living. He's telling me this with a childlike fervour, and in return, I'm feeling warmly paternal. So I can't help but mention his father, a farmer, killed because of his too brown skin during the Civil War, although we were lucky They told us where we could find his body. And he says, yes, he was thinking as he stood on the meadow that one of these birds might well be his father, who'd followed him here to this uncomfortable country, where now the days hang stiff with frost and people huddle themselves in wool, stomping their feet at bus stops. As for my own father, who said before he died, he'd never really known what it felt like to be loved. With his sharp nose and gleaming eyes, he'd fit in well with the crows. I think he might find among them a sense of belonging, of something he could call home. Later, I meet him, perched on the washing line outside my flat. He tells me what I know already, that some people spend all their lives in search of a refuge. For them, the sparrow that flits through the mead hall feels in an alien space and exiled, for now, from the true and beautiful dark. Thank you. It's now my very great pleasure to introduce one of my closest friends, the amazing Helen Mort. Helen came to prominence as a poet with her first two collections, Division Street and No Map Could Show Them, but she's now, I think, really well known as a writer across pretty much all genres. She's had a collection of short stories, a novel, Black Car Burning, out a couple of years ago, a non-fiction book last year, and another one coming out next year called A Line Across the Sky. She's written a stage play and she writes regularly for radio. I think I was trying to work on because Helen's a rock climber and she's been out rock climbing today, I was trying to come up with a really fancy metaphor about that would draw a link between her writing and her rock climbing. But I'm a little bit fuzzed having been on penicillin for a week, so I'm not going to attempt it. But she is a writer who takes risks, and I think is somebody who's totally committed to getting the right words on the page, and not in any way concerned with how she might appear to the reader, which is an all too rare quality among writers, I have to say. She's not only fantastically generous to the people she writes for, she's generous to other poets through her work as a teacher at MMU and through her mentoring with people such as Carl. So will you please give a huge round of applause for Helen Mort.
Oh my goodness, thank you, Alan. That is without doubt the most thoughtful and generous introduction that I've ever had at reading. It's such a pleasure to be here and to be reading in such esteemed company tonight, and to be at the launch of Carl's fantastic pamphlet, which it's been a privilege to work on. It really, really has. When I started doing some freelance mentoring sort of a couple of years ago, Carl was the first person that I worked with, and I feel like that's kind of spoiled all future mentoring because he's been so brilliant and such a joy to have conversations about poetry with, and I've enjoyed working on this book so much. I'm thrilled that that it's found a home with such an excellent publisher as well. So yeah, congratulations, Carl, and lovely to read with everyone. I'm going to start with two short rain poems. I feel it's a 2 rain poem day today, if it's anything like for everyone what it's like in Sheffield. And the first one's just called Wild Garlic, and it's for my little boy Alfie. Wild Garlic. By Porter Brook, you are stubborn as water, trampling through wild garlic, white flowers, pale scum on the surface of the river, aftermath of force. You make a path, and this is all you want, circling close to the banks, repeating your steps, barely taller than the stalks and grasses. Then it starts to belt down, roiling, kelching, and when I think of you, it will always be like this. You are the rain and all its causes. You arrived from the blue and you ran from sunlight to shadow, unstoppable, sturdy as a tree root, determined to take your time. Alan came on a trip with me and Alfie not long ago, and I think he can confirm that Alfie is determined to take his time. many hours of time. This second rain poem is set in a bit further north. It's set in Glasgow. The rain I brought north with me, a Yorkshire vale, the sky like something almost overheard, or like the petrified grey bird inside the Kelvin Grove Museum, its neat impression of an owl, the stuffed beige dog that looked as if it might still howl, a rooted sentry on a tall glass case, the cheetah with its elevated face and one raised paw, the way we tried to move as if we'd not been here before, the science test we stopped to take to see if we were sensitive to bitterness, a white strip held for seconds on the tongue, a strangeness they said wouldn't last for good, or how you couldn't taste it and I could. I loved the photograph, the image that's on the cover of Changing Places, and it gives me a nice excuse to read a poem about trees, which is always any excuse to do so. And it's a beautiful image, and I think it works really well with the poems. So this is I find myself writing about trees constantly, and I think sometimes when there's a subject like that keeps coming back, I find that I just have to write into it and go, okay, right, I'm just going to just really try and write about that until the fascination dwindles, but it still hasn't with trees. And this is kind of about trees and their representations. And I apologize in advance because it's set partly in Brussels and there's some French in it, and my French is pronounced in South Yorkshire, Northeast Derbyshire style, so apologies in advance. Vanishing point. Avenues of trees, avenues of hairless silver trees that never touch, avenues that bring the evening to its knees, stooping to enter their tunnel, trees that wear new rain like a transparent glove, or hold their branches shakily in front of them like hands spotted with someone else's blood. Avenues of trees that lean, still drunk at dawn, dreaming new names for themselves. Parades of trees, armies of pale trees. No, avenues of trees under avenues of night air. Planned, tended avenues curling down the hill to Sablon like loosed hair, like a word on your tongue. Allez, venir. The accent wrong, a language you can almost hear when I breathe against your cheek, breathe in your ear, and shut my eyes, go down with you through avenues of painted trees, trees oiled in shadow, framed and held, imaginary trees that wait as if you could enter them, avenues of trees, avenues of poplar, lime, the long-lined year, the avenue I watch you walking down, and follow you and can't get near. And one of the things that it's been really nice talking to Carl about is the landscape around sort of Middleton and Oldham, which is where my dad's family are from and where I spent a lot of my childhood. And in fact, there's a pub that's mentioned in one of the poems that Carl read today, which is where all our sort of family wakes and stuff have been, so I know that pub really well. Anyway, I thought I couldn't miss the opportunity to read a poem set in Oldham that also references one of the region's finest exports, a band called the Oldham Tinkers. If you don't know them, then you should. They've got many great hits, including a piece about Oldham's burning sands, which sort of imagines the Middleton sort of Greater Manchester area as a tropical paradise. And so this is Oldham's burning sands. Sundays were last train to Dobcross, sit thee down, the blunt crescendo of on Oldham's burning sands. that dead half hour between the white heart kicking out and tea left cooling on the kitchen tabletop, our front room brimming with the orange groves of Wordsworth, long guitar solos that sounded like a cardigan unravelling in Saddleworth. My dad conducted from the floor, and Mum, you should have told me Grandad's street in Oldham smelled of Sarson's vinegar, not coconut, that people sing the sweetest when they're drunk. But thank you for my ignorance. Those nights I'd mouth approximations of the words, lie down beside the palm leaf coloured couch, the small sun of the hanging lamp, and burn. And it's true. My granddad's street used to sort of smell like a jar of pickled eggs with the lid taken off because of the vinegar works nearby. I'm going to finish. Thank you. It's been such a privilege to read today for all of you, and lovely to see so many familiar faces in the audience as well. I think Nadia, you organise such great Zoom events. It always feels like being part of a community. Yeah, I'm going to finish with a poem called The Dogs, which is sort of about the what can sometimes seem the flimsy barrier between the human world and the animal world, and it's sort of my clumsy attempt to segue into introducing wonderful Charles Foster, who's going to read next, because he's written so brilliantly about animals and consciousness and the animal world. So this is just called The Dogs, and it's about my two whippets. The dogs. Some mornings, waking up between the sandy whippet and the black, their breathing slow as mine, their eyes more sorrowful, I remind myself I'm not a dog. It's not acceptable to taste the grass or roll in moss until I'm musked with it. There are deer in the woods I'll never see. My thirst discriminates. It does not have me bend my grateful head to puddles, gutters, hollows in the rock. I don't track rabbits in my sleep. I'll not know love like theirs, observed in mute proximity. And if I sometimes sit bolt upright after dark, sensing a movement in the yard, it's only that I've learned a little of their vigilance. I'm not like them. One night, I'll set off past the meadow, down behind the beck, beyond the blunt profile of Silverhow, and nobody will call me back. Thanks everyone, and yeah, looking forward to hearing you read again, Carl, as well. It's been really nice to read with everyone. So I'm now going to introduce the wonderful Charles Foster. It's very hard to introduce Charles, I think, because I'm not just saying this as a way of justifying my rambling, terrible introduction, but he's a genuine polymath and a Renaissance person whose intellect and wide-ranging curiosity about the world is matched by the way he goes into every kind of intellectual inquiry with heart and with body as well, and it's a very embodied way of thinking about the world, which I absolutely love. Yeah, he's also, as well as a writer, he's a barrister, a traveller, and I absolutely love the I'm going to quote the description of Charles's work that's on his website, because I just think it's really great. So his books include Being a Beast, The Screaming Sky, and forthcoming Being a Human, which is absolutely amazing. And it says on his website of his books, ultimately they are all presumptuous and unsuccessful attempts to answer the questions, who or what are we, and what on earth are we doing here? And what other questions matter, quite frankly? And I don't think I've ever read such enjoyable and convincing attempts to answer them as Charles's books. So yeah, please welcome Charles Foster.
Thank you so very much, Helen, for that tremendously generous introduction. And it's a great privilege to join this party. It's a great privilege to help this extraordinary pamphlet on its way. Introducing a friend to others is one of the loveliest of jobs, but because I'm coming after everyone has been introduced, I'm feeling deprived. So I'm not, in fact, going to read any of my stuff, and I'm quite sure that nobody's going to be devastated by that. Instead, I thought that I would explore with you some of my own efforts to work out what Carl is about. I want to tell you how Carl introduced himself to me, how I got to know him, and what I've made of him. I have never met Carl in the flesh. Helen introduced me to his poems, and so his poems are all that I know about him. And that made me very cautious about lending my support to this pamphlet, because what I want above all to see in a poet or any writer is integrity. And I mean by that they write as they live, that they speak with the same voice in their poems or their prose as they use to talk to their children or to the person manning the checkout at the supermarket. How could I judge Carl's integrity in that sense? I thought, well, as it turned out, it wasn't hard. Let me give you 3 examples. Firstly, from one of his poems in this pamphlet, Milk Marketing, we lift 6 empties and get them on the, it had a name which I've forgotten. Now, if Carl had been bogus, he'd want to impress us with his research, with his knowledge of an arcane word. The fact that he tells us when he can't remember a word makes me think that I can trust him when he does remember a word and chooses to use it. Second example, he writes about kids playing with Lego, and he says, bits of us, scraped no doubt from ear or nose, were smeared onto the Lego blocks. Now, I was skeptical about that line when I first read it. Some poets might do it in order to shock, to make a brazen show of their authenticity. But the context makes it clear that that's not what Carl is about. He's simply telling it how it is. And the bogies on the Lego blocks make a serious point in a disgustingly concrete and highly effective way about the presence of the past, which most poets approach elliptically, mystically, pompously, sanctimoniously. Third example, there's the directness of his writing about his own bereavements, and particularly the death of his brother. For a skinny lad who'd been so ill, you made a lot of ash. I hated reading that. I resented the invitation to share in pain that was so raw. But I recognize in that invitation the voice of someone who doesn't speak with a forked tongue. No one would write that to impress, right? No one would write to enable him to put the job description poet on his passport application. Writing it must have been far more costly and agonizing than reading it. The only possible reason for writing it is because the truth matters so much that it's worth both experiencing and inflicting pain. So I concluded that Carl can be trusted. So having decided that he can be trusted, what does he ask us to trust him about? Well, above all, it seems to me that he's a poet of place. He sees place as defined primarily not by coordinates on a map or by the title deeds which indicate ownership, but by the past which lies encoded and active in the stones and in the air, a past which is always ready to pounce on and savage our presumptions, always ready to confound the insistence of our senses that we know, because we're here now, what this place is like now. And in that, he stands in the tradition of Alan Garner, but he is more radical still. Carl wants, it would seem to me, to abolish the idea of the now, an idea which seems to have little meaning for him, and to replace it with the idea of the here in which our bodies are enfolded, the here from which our bodies emerge, the here to which our bodies will return. Now, identity for him seems to be dependent on a connection with place. Without identity, you don't have any agency, you don't have any right to use personal pronouns. Unless you know who you are, you can't say I love or I pray or I fear. So that is all a long-winded way of saying, and Carl doesn't do it anything like so long-windedly, that agency and selfhood demand that we are in and we are from a place with which we have a defining relationship, and with which we are in a constant two-sided conversation. So we don't just listen to a monologue that seeps out of a hill. We speak to the hill in Carl's world, and it changes in response to what we say. And that's the source of much of our significance and dignity. Because if I can change a hill, right, I'm a big person. Now, in less adroit hands, this could easily turn sentimental or sinister. So far as sentimentality is concerned, frankly, I rather wish that there were more in his poems. It would soften some of the blows that he lands on sensitive spots in my psyche. So far as sinister is concerned, there's no blood and soil fascism anywhere in these poems. Anyone could come from Syria or Pakistan and establish just as vibrant a connection to the place as those whose ancestors moulder in the churchyard. But for him, we each have a place. He says, my uncle's trying to stay where I was sure we all belonged. So there is a place where we belong, from which it follows disastrously that there are places to which we don't belong. The alienation that makes many of his poems desolate is the desolation of dislocation. I can't thrive outside my place because I'm a function of the place. Putting it pompously, ontology is conditioned by geography. So the people who really are themselves and who therefore are the proper agents, who have the capacity to have a really great conversation with the hill, people who have the capacity to move the hill and change it, the proper movers and shakers, are the people who never move and who rarely shake. Carl writes, the headstones at St. John's say that we were stayers once. The people who did stay, who now lay carpets in my father's house or became plasterers, farmers and footy players, and who drink the same pint in the same seat in the pub, are for him the real elite. So the elite are not the metropolitan poets who've gone away, acquired what we ironically call education, who acquire distance and a big suite of metaphors, and who look back on the village with distance and dispassion and a sense of superiority. Now, Carl, I think, becomes a chronicler of dislocation, not because he has a morbid, mawkish fascination with pathology, but because to describe the pathology of dislocation is the best way to excite us with normal anatomy. Normal anatomy we get used to, but the best way of describing the anatomy of the bone in the right socket, of the stayers, in other words, who we would normally overlook or find too humdrum for comment, is to describe what happens when the stayers are ripped out of their place, when the bone is ripped out of the socket. Now, that focus on dislocation makes his poetry seem often very dark. And when I was reading this pamphlet, I had constantly to remind myself that this is not darkness for darkness' sake, but it's darkness which is there to make the light all the more visible. But there's no doubt that it's painful. Here he is writing about the loss of the family farm. He's writing about baling. It's a different kind of ache when it's not your hay. There's an important line, I thought, which reads, grief doesn't always dress in death. And the metaphysical logic of that's impeccable. So if dispossession produces the same sort of reaction as laying the body of a loved one on the ground produces, dispossession is the same sort of thing as death. It's morally significant in the same way as death is. It has ripples throughout a whole ecosystem as the death of any individual does. And that, it seems to me, is Carl's justification for what might otherwise be a morbid preoccupation with death and decay. What's he doing? He's exploring the nature of the rupture in relationship that comes when bodies move away, either by physical death and dissolution, or because they've been brought up and expelled from the land. The nature of our relationship with the land will change, even if we're one of the stayers. Even the stayers drink, as Carl says, the milk you never touch and scarcely see. All is process for him, all is change. I borrow, he says, a breath of this shining hair. Everything's lent. We don't have proper title to anything. He's bound his grandfather by shared frailty. The sunshine in Oxford in early October surrenders too early to dusk. The agents of dislocation are frightening because of their impersonality. They bear no malice. And because they bear no malice, because they're not enjoying the process of killing you or torturing you, you can't appeal to them. They come from outside, whether they are cancers or auctioneers. So the farm in Carl's poetry was knocked down by an auctioneer I never met. The consequences of changes to our bodies, whether by disease or by the action of an auctioneer, are for Carl cosmic. They moved our sky when they banked up the earth to sling the motorway over the field. And a crucial insight, it seems to me, to be that the cosmos is local. It is our sky, he says. Though the most mundane and local of our human activities are cosmic in scale, and therefore infinitely suffused with dignity, Carl feels, entirely wrongly, I think, that he is a little person. The vastness, he says, swallows what I offer in return. And that, to my ear, is one of the few false notes in the pamphlet. But it's a false note generated by a thoroughly good instinct. The victory of the auctioneer or the cancer or the road builder is never complete. Nothing ever vanishes. The past is always waiting, poised to do its bit, to contribute, to join the redeeming conversation. Carl puts it like this: dead just means inanimate, not deceased. It could always be rewoken. There's always a way back, and the way is always provided by the natural world itself. The kites, he says, are introducing the man to the boy and his sky. And Carl elides the past and beauty. The past and the beauty are respectively the organs and the limbs of the fetus with which the world is pregnant. The wretchedness and the fear and the despair which are detailed in some of these poems are the labor pains. It doesn't take much to induce labor. It doesn't take much to cause beauty and the past together to emerge out of the womb of the hill and to make us complete. He puts it like this: at the kiss of a few fresh drops, the scent of 1,000 flowers drifts from the heat of sun-baked soil. There is far, far more epiphany than there is mourning. What I found of greatest value in his poetry was his epistemology, the consistent sense that apprehension is a more reliable guide to the nature of the world than comprehension. That a claim to comprehension is vanity, is bound to fall so far short of reality that it's not really worth the effort. And that epistemology, I think, is Carl's most distinctive project. And here it is in Cocksure. You've got a bird which is singing before a midwinter dawn has, quote, dared me to write what he apprehends. Carl took up the bird's challenge, and I'm very grateful. So Carl, thank you very much for a fantastic pamphlet from which I've learnt such a lot. And thank you to all of you for this invitation to join the party celebrating it.
Thank you very much indeed, Charles, for that thoughtful, generous, wholly unexpected response to the poems. I've been watching the screens while you've been speaking, and the reactions have been very powerful. I'm going to finish with a couple more poems, but before I do that, I need to say some thank yous. Firstly, to all of you for coming along this evening, for lighting up my screen and all the other 69 screens that I can see here. It really means a lot that you've all taken the time out of your evenings to support my work. To Alan and Helen and Charles, thank you again for being such an integral part of what's been, for me at least, a really special evening. Nadia, you are the most enthusiastic and encouraging publisher that I could wish to work with. That we're all, hopefully, we're all holding this in our hands. If we're not, you know where to get them. That we're able to, if we choose, hold this in our hands is down to you. And I'm enormously grateful. The dedication in the pamphlet is for my family. When I was a kid, when I was growing up, my mum and dad had pretty clear views about how long a boy's hair should be and how many earrings he should wear, respectively short and none. As I got a bit older, got into my teens, I began to take a bit more control of my appearance. I use the term advisedly. And yeah, and longer hair meant that with the aid of a girlfriend, a darning needle, and a couple of ice cubes, I could acquire my first earring. While all that was going on, my brother and my mother were losing their hair to unsuccessful treatments for cancer. This poem's called Hair Loss. Mum dragged us uphill to the barber, where, sat on a plank, we were steel-combed and fringed. Our annual school photos show bowl-rimmed grins. You've got a calf lick, you can't have long hair. My brother died with his tight, light curls reduced to a wisp here and there. In interview week, she gave me a trim, though shaggier boys would also get in. The earring, which for years was forbidden, now shone in my newly visible lobe. Dad admired the haircut. Much smarter, short. I showed off the stud to show him I dared. You were told not to have that. No more. In death, her hair was a half-inch of velvet. The wig went in the bin. Late one evening, they hacked at my curls for charity in the college bar. A quid, a snip, for a search for a cure. It's nice to see at least one person and maybe a couple of others who were in the college bar that night, snipping away at my curls. I'm going to finish with the last poem in the pamphlet. It's called Harvest. Oh, bugger, the words thud. I've just put the fork through a spud. I'm showing our son and daughter something I learned from my father, which my granddad had taught him before. You start a bit off, away from the green. Keep the fork away from the tubers. You want to lift them, not pierce them, and they'll not store if you fork them. They'll be no good if you fork them. Again, the fork sinks, again the soil shifts, and this time a big un gets stuck on a tine. Oh, bugger, I thud, before I'm stood up, and quick as an echo, the lad pipes up with, that's what our granddad said, when he put his fork through a spud. Sorry, I'm smiling because I can see my son's glimmer of recognition in one of the screens. Thank you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Well, there's nothing much left for me to say except thank you to everybody. Thank you to everyone who's been listening and watching. Thank you to everyone who's spoken. It's just been an hour of love and truth, and I'm just so grateful to you all for listening and for speaking. And to Carl, I don't know how you managed to speak after what Charles had said, but you did. And Changing Places is officially launched into the world, and I am so proud of it. And well done, well done. Thank you all so very much.